Aloha everyone, hope you're having a glorious day. This is a series on boundaries, Jesus Way, and it's part 2 in the series. Now, for those of us who follow Jesus, are boundaries really necessary? What I mean by that is we are called to love others sacrificially. So shouldn't we just love others without boundaries? What's the one test to determine a necessary boundary? Noor is a Muslim woman who met with the board of imams to obtain an Islamic divorce. She brought them a tape she recorded of a tirade from her husband who smashed doors, yelled at her in front of the kids, and beat her when she talked to him about the finances. And the imams denied the divorce ultimately because they wanted her to go back and try again for the sake of the kids. Now, there's a common cultural myth that goes like this. Well, God is love, and Christians should just love. Christians should just affirm. Christians should just accept. So, do we need to just accept Noor, affirm the situation she's in, and tell her to accept the marriage her imams and Muslim community encourages her to live in? When you hear what is on Noor's heart, it sounds like this. Would the God of the universe who made me want me and my children to stay in a marriage and be beaten? This is why we talk about boundaries. And in the previous video, we learned that the boundary between us and God is knowing that we need God and trusting He came for us in the person of Jesus. But Jesus doesn't force us to follow Him, and Jesus is not a once and done type of a relationship. This is not a one-night stand. It's not a once upon a time I was baptized, once upon a time I was confirmed, and well, that's good enough. See, a relationship with Jesus instructs us daily as to how we love others with the love of God. So boundaries intuitively seem unnecessary when we consider Jesus' life. So if we are to follow Jesus' sacrificial agape love, His example of the death on the cross for us, well, it seems not necessary that we have boundaries. And that's because this was not the original design. This was not God's original purpose for us. See, His original purpose was that we were in the garden face to face. That one of the first things that God did after the fall was put a boundary in place, blocking the garden. See, man originally was made eternal, but became temporal after the fall. Once man was in communion with God, without boundary, face to face, but this was removed. They were blocked from the life-giving source, the tree of life, with a boundary. Now, man, after the fall, in his corruptible, fallen state, would drop dead face to face with a holy God, because God cannot live in close proximity to what is defiled. Therefore, He placed a boundary to protect us. This boundary was placed between God and man. This boundary was between heaven and earth. This boundary was placed between what is eternal and what is temporary, what is fading away. God's will was to draw close again with His creation. So He wrote Himself into history, into His story, into our story, and gave us His Son, Jesus. That was God's will. But Jesus performs a surgery and separates the boundary of your old self, your corruptible self, into a new creation where He lives and dwells in you. God's will is to be back in the garden-like relationship with us face to face without boundaries. This is God's will. But we live in a fallen world, now with limited, finite time, energy, and resources, even though we long to get back to the garden where there are no boundaries, I mean, this is why we don't like boundaries. We don't like rules. We don't like laws. We're not back in the garden yet. And we can only get there through Jesus. Our relationship with Jesus changes everything in our lives, which constitutes a boundary. What we do, what we don't do, our priorities, how we spend our time, energy, and resources, it even changes the people who we pour into. So boundaries are how we figure out who and where we invest our time, energy, and resources in. Since God came down and showed us sacrificial love, shouldn't we just show sacrificial agape love towards others without expectation of reward or reciprocation? Should Nora just keep loving her husband for the sake of her children till she was beaten to death? Is it loving as Christians to stand by, to just accept and affirm Nora? We absolutely need to show one another agape, sacrificial type love, but sometimes love comes in the form of a boundary, as we just learned from the garden, the boundary that God set on us. And with boundaries, should we keep pouring into others until we keel over dead? Well, that's fine for eternal beings with unlimited time and unlimited resources. But how do we show the sacrificial agape love we are called to by following Jesus here and now in this temporal world? I think it comes in the form of this. If we only have one life to give, who would we give it up for? This is why we have to figure out boundaries. Jesus asks us to give up our life for God by taking up our cross and following Jesus. How should we love others and have boundaries when God loved us so freely? Well, ask yourself, what are your motivations for loving others? Is it to prove you are worthy or deserving of love? Are your motivation for loving others so that the other will love you back? Well, the motivation of agape love is I love you because I love you. I'm not afraid to set a boundary with you. I'm not afraid if you reject me or don't love me back. But also, I'm not afraid to give up my own comfort, my own resources, time, energy, and money when led by God's will, when led by loving you because God loved me and I love you. The main question you must ask yourself is this: is the way I'm loving you doing God's will, or is it my own will? This series is about making boundaries Jesus' way. And boundaries Jesus' way is doing God's will. So an unnecessary boundary, that should not block God's will. What are unnecessary boundaries blocking God's will? What are the things like pride? They might be religion or unforgiveness or worrying about what other people think. A boundary should exist when something in front of you is clearly not God's will. It is not God's will, nor should be beaten. God's will for us is to live like Jesus. And Jesus told us how men are to treat their wives. So Nora needs a boundary so her husband can't hurt her anymore. She needs a boundary so that imams can't hurt her or the Muslim community doesn't keep her in this abuse. So if boundaries are doing God's will, who is the only human who did God's will? That's Jesus. Next time, we will look more at God's will and our will in learning boundaries Jesus' way.